Hey guys, welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about height in Beyblade X. So I see a lot of different speculation, a lot of videos talking about height and why 80 height is good or why 80 height is bad or why people use 60 height. And so today we're going to talk about it a little bit. First things first, let's just get it out of the way. The Takara Tomy typing chart is not always accurate. The way that they label things on the back of the box or the way that they assign certain typings to parts is kind of arbitrary. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not. The best habit to get into is completely ignoring whatever Takara Tomy types it as and actually play test for yourself and figure out functionally what things are good for. For example, Hexa is considered to be one of the best defensive bits in the game, whereas in the anime or on the box, it labels it more as a balance type bit. So in this case, Hexa is actually rated with a lower defensive power than High Needle, which is not true in practical application. Hexa is arguably the best defensive bit in the game, and High Needle often has issues with bursting, and because of its higher height, has an issue with getting KO'd, as well as destabilization. Hexa effectively solves all of these issues. The other issue with the Takara Tomy typing for Hexa is that it also rates it as having an equal attack rating as Taper, which obviously is not true. Hexa basically has no attack properties. You could argue counterattack properties, but I still wouldn't label it anywhere close to how good or effective Taper is as an attack bit. So my most recent video, I talked about how Silver Wolf is fairly good for defense. I think it is still a good stamina type by Takara Tomy's account. I think it's pretty decent. I don't think it replaces Wizard Rod. However, I do think it's a fairly good defense type. The build uses Hexa, which is technically not defensive either, and it also uses 960, which you could argue is defensive. However, 760 technically is the bit that has been assigned for strictly for a defense type, and a lot of times 80 height has been used for defensive types. Ratchets are another one as well that I get a lot of comments about, and I see a lot of talk about online on YouTube or in different Discord chats about whether or not 60 height, 70 height, or 80 height is better, what's better for stamina, what's better for defense, etc. And this a lot of times is going to come down to the application. What blade are you using? Why would you want it lower? Why would you want it higher? But in general, lower height is typically what you're going to see people use competitively because it drops the center of gravity. Now, you could technically put something on 80 height, something that's balanced, let's say Wizard Rod on 80 height, and you would get potentially a longer spin time, a solo spin time on 80 height than you would on 60 height. However, in practical application, 60 height versus 80 height, let's say you did Wizard Rod on 60 versus Wizard Rod on 80, oftentimes 80 would end up losing because it would end up getting destabilized by the 60 height. So the taller ratchets are going to have a much harder time recovering from destabilization than the lower heights because of the lifted center of gravity. That's why a lot of people are going to use 60 height, because it is almost always more effective to be lower than it is to be higher. The one exception to this, I think a good example, is in Metal Fight. Flame 230, CS, or Metal Ball is a very common competitive combo because of how tall it is. It's very hard for lower height things to end up knocking it out. There are a couple exceptions. There's some good counters for it. But in general, that's one of the few exceptions. For Metal Fight Competitive, for example, a huge portion of the competitive builds are going to be on the lower height tracks. I often also see comments about the tightness of lower or higher ratchets, that 60 height somehow has lower burst resistance than the taller height ratchets. This isn't the case. So the way that the ratchets slot in is the little plastic tabs up to the left and the right of these sort of white centerpiece is what actually clips it in. Now, the one thing that you could maybe argue is that the little tabs that hold in the bit are longer or shorter depending on how tall the ratchet is, and that could play an effect. However, The lower height you are, the harder it is for something to make contact with your ratchet, therefore minimizing the chances of actually getting burst or making contact with the opposing blade, which increases the chance of bursting. I've also seen talk about springs in the ratchets being tighter on taller ratchets. There are no springs in the ratchets on Beyblade X. There are 0 springs involved currently in ratchets. So completely disregard anybody who says anything about spring tightness. It doesn't exist. There are no springs. Now, does that mean you should only ever use 60 height? Not necessarily. For example, there are some instances where I will use 70 height. So it's a 1 millimeter difference from 60 height. And the reason that I do that is based off of how the two potential opposing Beyblades will line up in terms of the contact points. However, I almost never go all the way to 80 height just because of the higher risk of something getting underneath you, which makes it way easier for you to get knocked into the pockets, KO'd, or burst, because you don't want contact with your ratchet. That's a surefire way to get burst fairly easily. And again, the ability to recover from destabilization on higher ratchets is not always super great either. So the reason why so far height has not been a huge thing in Beyblade X is because of how tall the Beyblades are already. So people in general are wanting to use the lower height ratchets to bring them down as much as possible. Once we have things like 50 height or 55, then we might see more variation in what people are actually using in tournaments. But in general, 80 at the current stage of the game oftentimes is just too tall to use effectively competitively. Now, all of this is not to say that you should never use 80 height or you shouldn't test things on 80 height. You should always test like a multitude of things anytime something new comes out or you get something new. I encourage everybody to test things as much as possible. However, when you're going onto videos and you're watching tournaments or you're seeing other people's combos or whatever and you're wondering why nobody is using 60 height, that is the primary reason. It has more downsides than it has upsides at the current stage of the game, with the exception of like 70 height. I think 60 height and I think 70 height are perfectly usable, but I think 80 height just creeps it too far and it makes it way too risky, especially against things like Shark or Viper on like low flat or Unite or any of the lower bits that we have. And again, I'm not saying to never use 80 height or not to test things on 80 height. I'm just explaining why most people don't use it and why you don't see it being used competitively a whole lot. That's not to say that no one uses it. There are definitely some exceptions. There are some combos that people have found on 80 height that do relatively okay. However, it's the minority of people that end up using it just because 60 is such a safer option overall. Anyway, let me know what you think down in the comments. Hit the like for the algorithm. Subscribe if you haven't already for future Beyblade content. If you want more videos like this one, I will have a playlist at the end of a guide full of different Beyblade videos that you guys can check out. And I will see you guys in the next one.